hub was set up at COP25 in Madrid, and it was set up by the German government as a platform for dialogue, competence development, and policy dialogue. Now, 3 years later, we were initially 4 people. We are 40 people in 13 countries. One of the initial persons was Alexander Mahler, sitting here and now being the representative of the International Power-to-X hub here in South Africa. We had a long debate, should we be the green hydrogen hub? We decided for the more complicated title, the International Power-to-X hub. Why? Because we think one should think about beyond hydrogen, really through the entire supply chain to the final products, and thereby reflect the opportunities of using the value chains, not just in a logic of exports, but really also to the development of the country itself. I was supposed to give a longer introductory presentation on the EESG sustainability framework developed by the International Power-to-X hub. I decided that in the interest of time for discussion, I cut this short, and I will only give a few slides because we have an excellent panel prepared and lined up, and therefore I would really like to jump into the presentation quickly. I hope the technology works. So our title, Requirements and Frameworks for Power-to-X Sustainability. You all know the background. The colors from blue to orange and red indicate the increase in annual temperature from 1850 to 2021 compared to a base period 1850 to 1900. And you see the correlation with the increasing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So, in order, here we get stuck. Can you move it, please? Okay. So, it's clear we have to bring down CO2 emissions, and I would call this the Paris Delta. If we want to meet the Paris Agreement targets, all sectors need to get involved. We need to increase energy efficiency, improve it in all sectors. We need increase in renewable energy, and we need electrification wherever possible. However, there is a gray loophole remaining, which we cannot close only with electricity. That's where we need green electrons, and to achieve net zero, we need, therefore, green hydrogen and its derivatives, in particular in those sectors that cannot be easily electrified. However, very much the debate where I come from, in Germany or in Europe, is risks to actually operate in what I would call the carbon tunnel vision. We tend to forget about a lot of other important global challenges, be it biodiversity loss, be it inequality, be it health. We should not only see the challenge as a carbon climate issue. And clearly the scheme that sets out the whole range of concerns is the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 to be reached in less than 8 years. Now, oh, it gets even bigger, but now you can't see the bottom end. So this is a way, the circle is nice, but you lose the perspective. If you try to organize it a bit, that's what we did with this triangle. You can distinguish those objectives that relate to planet, to people, to prosperity. And this was the beginning of our Power to X EESG frame. It has the environmental dimension, the economic dimension, the social and the governance dimension. Very often in the banking sector and investment sector, it is the ESG frame. Very often the second E, the economic development perspective, is not addressed. And for countries like South Africa, but in general developing countries, of course, a main driver is the economic dimension. Now, for each of these 4 dimensions, we have clustered all the concerns into 4 clusters of concern in order to not lose perspective. And, well, we still have 16. We will not be able to present all those in detail. But you see, under environmental, it is about where does the electricity come from? What is the carbon cycle? Where does water come from? Land? What are the impacts on biodiversity? Where are the critical raw materials? And can they be recycled? Pollution and other issues. Very important, I think, in the context of the developments currently here in South Africa or in Namibia, where I've been in the last week. Land, water, biodiversity. Economic, again, I just pick one element. What is the energy mix currently? And South Africa still has less than 20% renewable electricity in its grid. So in that context, discussing exporting wind and sun to Europe, question mark. What is the balance? The social aspects are crucial. Access to electricity for a lot of people. In Africa, it's more than 80% connected to the grid, but in Africa there are 600 million people still not connected to electricity, and just in Namibia it's about 50%. So issues to be discussed if we go for hydrogen and power to X. How do we deal with these aspects? What is the job and skills dimension? Are we properly prepared? And also the governance dimension, very important. What's the policy commitment? Yesterday we heard the president. Clearly there is commitment, but we have to also be sure that there is sufficient transparency and participation. Participation in particular also of the civil societies. With that, I would stop my presentation. I think there is one more slide which I will skip, and if you want to have a look at this outline, I think there are postcards next to your chairs. Take them and you can have the presentations. So with that, talking about civil society, I would like now to call our panelists to the panel, and I would like to start with Makoma Lekalakala. Please take your seat. She is the director of Earth Life Africa. Maybe a little applause. Earth Life Africa is an NGO that seeks for a better life for all people without exploiting other people or degrading their environment. She is a leader and campaigner since many years for a fair society and just transition. Actually, she participated in a panel at COP 2 weeks ago, which the Hub organized together with the German NGOs. And I can tell you, you made a strong impression. And yeah, she was recently appointed to the Presidential Climate Commission, where she will deal in particular with just transition issues. Now, the second representative also from the civil society movement, Farai. Farai Shishi is from WWF South Africa, and there he is project officer and energy analyst, and he is a professional focusing on technological advancements and climate change mitigation and adaptation issues. He's been an energy fellow at the Climate Champions team for the COP in Glasgow, where he led analytical work on renewable energy futures for Africa. The third panelist is Laurens Klote. He is senior consultant with the Rebel Group. Don't be shy. It is not a revolutionary organization. It is a consulting and investment firm, and aiming at impact, working on sustainability, but also on urban development, transportation, and many others. He has 3 decades with CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research here in South Africa, and therefore I think he has a long history in the field of energy and related sustainability topics, which are the topic of our session. Finally, last panelist, coming from Germany, Gian Wieck from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, where he is in particular also in charge of looking at green hydrogen. In parallel, he is a systems modeler and co-founder of Sustainable Mapping Academy. Before he worked with the Millennium Institute, also on systemic issues related to sustainable development. So with that, you know the panel, and I would actually like to give you all an initial 3-minute opportunity to briefly present yourself and add to the little comments I had. The 3 minutes we learned yesterday, the moderator will not brutally interrupt you, but just start smiling. That worked yesterday, and I hope it will work today. Thank you. So, Makoma, please.
Your smile will be welcome, maybe after 4 minutes or less.
Yes, I mean, we had that theme also. Our gender balance is still not what it should be, so you get 2 extra minutes.
Thank you for that, but I'm not sure if I'll use all the minutes. Getting to understand and to know, and also hearing from a number of people at this conference, there are questions that come up. But one of the issues that has been there for quite a long time, it's that of environmental, social, and economic safeguards of the technology. We heard how this is a new technology, this is a technology under development, and there has not been any international standards that are set around technology, unless if maybe I'm missing a point, because this is quite new for some of us in the NGO sector. We're still busy trying to understand the in and outs of that. But one thing that I can say is that from our point of view, we welcome the technology if the technology is not carbon intensive, because it's meant to decarbonize our economy. It's meant to assist in reduction of the emissions in the atmosphere. The international standards, they would have to be there before anything could happen. But I see already people are ahead of bringing about or of actually construction of building plants around the hydrogen. Those standards would assist because we have that universal concept. We are worried more about climate change, and that means those international standards would guide us that they should know that there should not be harm to the environment, and also take into consideration the local context of where the identified sites or areas for the manufacturing or the generation of hydrogen, particularly the green hydrogen. I mean, the other pink, gray, whatever, that's one thing that in any way would not support, because it comes from the fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are responsible for the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. But those international standards, I think we know that there are other international standards, particularly from the multilateral banks, but and also from the local banks, and also from other industries. But what is important, that should come first of any environmental, economic, and social safeguard, it's the notion that people need to be informed. The free, prior, informed consent is a prerequisite to anything that would happen at any area, because this is impactful. If people are not familiar, like I can confidently say that in South Africa, not ordinary people, people whose lands are going to be taken, people whose livelihood are going to be affected, have a free, prior, informed consent undertaken with them. People would not know about the disadvantages and the advantages of the technology in their areas. And this is worrying, particularly that the country system are used. And we know that even if we have country systems in South Africa, we have experiences where the country systems were not a guide towards environmental and social safeguard. We can mention that in either some of the projects around the fossil fuels, that these country systems did not work. Yep. I love your smile.
Okay. Well, thank you for these 5 minutes, but you already brought up very important points. And maybe to disappoint you, we cannot draw the international standards from the shelf. Part of our work, this exercise, was to contribute to the development of these standards. However, you were right. Interestingly, it's the banks who are now already having prepared some of these guidelines. These are nice on paper, and I trust that maybe KfW, EIB are in the room, that they are increasingly taking this very serious. However, issues like free, prior, informed consent are currently on the paper, but we really need to get that installed in practice, and that needs support for organizations such as yours, and in particular on the spot where the investments are happening. So, Farid, are you following on that, and have you additional aspects from your WWF perspective?
Thanks, Aino. Just to add in there, I think from the WWF perspective, we do realize the critical role that green hydrogen would play in decarbonization. And we know this incipient green hydrogen economy is going to blow up at some stage. And we need to make sure that the different sustainability safeguards are put in. And I think the work that you've done with the different frameworks for the economic, environmental, social, as well as governance issues are some of the things that we look at and try to get embedded in these systems going forward. I think first and foremost, as Makoma says, we're going for green hydrogen because we want to reduce our emissions. So I think that has to be at the forefront of everything, that we need to make sure that particularly any greenhouse gas emissions or assessments being done to enable the true sustainability of this. And also an important thing that we need to take into account is to this concept of the origins of this green hydrogen, to be able to track it when it's sold to different partners to ensure that it is indeed green hydrogen. Now we do know that there are kind of different certification schemes, and some of which are not regulated, which brings different issues like double counting, where someone gets to claim, or two different people get to claim reduction benefits from the same green hydrogen. So we need to kind of bring in some of that regulation into some of that standards so that we take it forward. And in terms of these standards, most of them being from overseas or Europe, they sometimes don't take into account maybe South Africa or local local situations or scenarios. I think that's something that we need to do, and I think that's a role that South Africa could work. I mean, given that most of the hydrogen is earmarked for export, we are probably going to be having to meet the European standards, but I think there's an opportunity for us to make sure that the local dimensions are just taken into account. Just from the social aspect, I think it's important to know that South Africa, as much as we have a higher energy access than the rest of the African continent, there are still some people without energy access. It's important to make sure that as these projects are being developed, they're developed with that angle to make sure that energy access is also improved to people within that community and elsewhere, and also issue around water issues. Most of these projects are planned in water-stricken areas, Northern Cape, Western Cape, Eastern Cape. How can we make sure that with the desalination projects, we're also working to improve water security? And I think from just an economic point of view, I think we've heard around the issues around value addition, I think, which is great. Let's work towards improving value addition and increasing job creation. And I think that will have very good ripple effects across the economy. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you. There are a couple of issues we need to come back to in the course of the discussion, but I would like to hand over to Lawrence. An initial statement. You know both the South African situation, but you have become also an expert on the EU regulatory frameworks, because talking about exports, at least, you have to also respect what's still in the making in Brussels.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be in such good company. As working for a company called Rebel, we have no problem sitting with people from civil society. Yes, the background to my participation here is that we just completed a project with our partners LBST in Germany, funded by GIZ as part of their partnership with the South African presidency on promoting green hydrogen in South Africa. And as part of that project, we looked at two aspects. The one is, can you safely and reliably produce green hydrogen from source, including desalination, renewable electricity generation, transport, through to actual use. And for that, you need regulations, codes, and standards. And if we have time, I can clarify the difference between those. And the other, and I think Farai alluded to that, is can you prove that what you produce is in fact green? And we looked at both of those. So how did we do it? We looked at the international scene, what is the current status internationally, and then what is the status in South Africa. So internationally, although not all the problems have been solved on the regulation codes and standards, there are many regulations, there are many standards which you can just adopt and use in South Africa, ISO and other standards. On the regulation side, I think there are excellent examples in many territories, Europe, Quebec, California, Japan, Korea, and so on. So what is the situation in South Africa? South Africa does not have a comprehensive regulatory regime for green hydrogen, but we do have the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and we have excellent environmental legislation which caters for many aspects. South Africa also has the industrial expertise. We've worked with hydrogen in what my chemical engineers call within the battery limit, so that's inside an industrial area in a factory, and as well as ammonia. We have more than 100 years experience in Modderfontein, initially for dynamite, for the mining industry and so on. So we know how to handle those things in those controlled areas. But if we want a hydrogen economy, we also need to power hydrogen buses and trucks, and we need to move them on public roads, and we cannot do that by exception every time. We need to have consistency and transparency so that industry can know what they have to do. In Germany, there's a good example of a guide on how to get approval for a hydrogen refueling station. California has something similar, if your German is not that good. And that's the kind of, in addition to the hard law, the regulations, there's the soft law issues that help people to comply. On the green hydrogen certification, currently South Africa has no scheme, we have no standards for that, but again, there are good international efforts underway, and there's nothing that prevents us from adopting those principles. I think they are good principles. A lot was learned from biofuels and other issues that went before hydrogen, and I think hydrogen is probably now the best green certification.
Well, thank you. We will come back to some of these examples, such as the Green Hydrogen Organization's standard, interestingly driven by the private sector. And maybe that's an issue to discuss. What's the role for the private sector in setting standards? What should be the public role? But who is quicker? We need to be quick. And there is this big issue. I mean, in the previous session here, the statements are, it's not the technology. We know how to do things. It's not so much finance. There is ample finance out there. We don't get the things together. Why? Partly because the regulatory frameworks are not yet fully established. So maybe here the sustainability panel has the boring part of insisting on this regulatory framework, and we are not the ones who want to build up new barriers, but we want to be sure that this really goes the right way and we're not experiencing the same or similar problems as we had with exploiting oil and gas, and where the local population didn't benefit. So from that perspective, BMZ, the German Development Cooperation, you are involved in many similar investment undertakings. What can you say? What could a northern ministry do to support the development of regulatory frameworks? You didn't get a microphone. I think it's on.
Yes. Yeah, first of all, yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, for me, it's also very curious to learn from your perspectives and to listen. From our perspective, from the perspective of the development ministry in Germany, green hydrogen is really a major part of the just transition. And so we see it has to play its role to kind of achieve the sustainable development goals on kind of the very different dimensions. And what we see with green hydrogen, what's fantastic, what we barely see somewhere else, is really this threefold potential that we can use there. So of course we talked about climate change, like one of the grand challenges of our time, kind of using green hydrogen to have kind of this last 20% of decarbonization. At the same time, of course, and that's what we heard about in the other panels as well, it's great business opportunity, it's possibilities for growth, but, and especially for us very important, it's also very interesting and very exciting for sustainable local development. So creating good jobs for the future, also providing electricity security, and of course also trying to foster the whole energy transition even besides the green hydrogen. And so what do we do as a ministry? We're supporting our partner countries such as South Africa to develop this sustainable market ramp up and to also develop local value chains that provide good jobs for the future. So we work together with GIZ, which are very much with the PTX hub or H2SA, working together with local partners, trying to build these platforms for exchange, for cooperation, for mutual learning. But on the other hand, we're also working together with the KfW, the development bank. So also then to have a way of financing, of funding those sustainable projects and put them in the spotlight for the future and as a role model. And last but not least, we also created a business alliance on green hydrogen, also with kind of the major goal of bringing together different actors from private sector, but also academia, civil society, and trying to talk, okay, what are the barriers, what are the needs of the green hydrogen economy, and how can we address those?
Makoma, you were very explicit. It must be clear that this new undertaking, Green Hydrogen Power to X, is actually not increasing greenhouse gas emissions. That is, I think, the whole idea. However, when we go to derivatives, to jet fuel, etc., there are issues. Where does the carbon come from, etc.? But beyond the carbon accounting, you also raised other serious issues about the access to energy for people, access to water, because where the wind and sun is shining, often we don't have sufficient water. Desalination will be needed. Do you see opportunities for, let's say, co-benefits, both installing renewable electricity for the electrolyzers? There will be naturally a certain surplus to use it for local communities. The desalination plants, should they not be creating some overcapacity to address also the water needs of the local communities? How are these big projects best integrated in a local context? Do you have any experiences from projects that worked or didn't work?
Yeah. Any process that is carbon intensive does not decrease greenhouse gas emissions. That's partly, desalination is also carbon intensive, and you go that route, obviously going to need more carbon, or you're going to burn more electricity to have water. So any project that has got to take place, its life cycle should be low cost. And the South African Electricity Regulation Act says whatever form of electricity or energy that the country decides upon, it needs to be low cost. And low cost would mean economically, low cost would also mean how much externalized costs would come from that activity. And so that is the basis. So if you have any activity, it must comply with regulations and legislation framework in the country. And that compliance, that is where, when we have standards, international standards, that will have to take into consideration the context of where the issue, the projects are being undertaken, but also that due diligence is done. no matter if you have country system, but due diligence has got to be done. And this is where the funders of most projects come in, and that is why you find most fossil fuels projects are no longer supported. Banks are divesting from supporting, banks are withdrawing, insurance companies have taken resolutions that they will no longer fund any fossil fuel project unless there's due diligence, and that due diligence obviously is in contradiction with the conventions on protecting the environment, that's in contradiction with local laws or local legislation in different countries. But in South Africa, we've seen that happening more and more, that you cannot take the risk of just going ahead with the project without having done due diligence. And this is where I think it's important, the risks of what I've heard yesterday, that we're going to go ahead and have so many projects have been given the special infrastructure, the presidential special infrastructure status, and we're going to kind of roll out and have a legislatory framework completed in a very short space of time. That's very risky. And that is being very risky. It's also violating, if you can't have a project that would violate the basic human rights of people in any country, in any context. So that is why I insist that those international standards are very important.
Well, thank you for bringing up the notion of due diligence. I think in Germany, at least, we now have a supply chain law which obliges company to really be transparent and make sure that in their supply chains there are no human rights violations, labor standards are met, and environmental conditions. The same will happen at the European level. So this is not something special you try to impose here. This will become the rule if you want to export. But obviously for South Africa, it's important to be aligned in that logic.
We'll hold you to that.
I want to come back later to the question of how can we ensure that this is the case. But Farid, maybe on the biodiversity dimensions, coming from Namibia, there is a debate producing hydrogen in a protected area, protected maybe not for biodiversity reasons historically, but these are issues that will count if you want to export. Do you have similar cases here?
Yeah, I'd say the issue of biodiversity is very important. I'm sure that the recent WWF report that we released a couple of weeks or months ago, just highlighted, how much of biodiversity we're losing. So it's quite critical, and it's very important that we do preserve areas, particularly those of high biodiversity. And as Makoma said, I mean, with some of these fast-track projects, there is a risk that, some of these assessments are not done, and there could be a risk to destroying some of those biodiverse areas. South Africa is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, so and it's got many benefits, because that's why people like to come to South Africa, because of all that. So it's really important that that biodiversity is conserved. And one thing that I would like to say from our experiences and what we've looked at is, when we are developing this hydrogen economy, let's look at what else, or what other parts of our society or economy can we transport, so that it's not just about green hydrogen, which other different value chains or value additions can we do. So linked specifically to to this biodiversity question that you've raised, we've looked into a problem of invasive alien plants. So these are your foreign plants which are not endemic to this region. They are water hungry, they destroy biodiversity, and of course they reduce climate resilience. So why are we not looking at bringing projects together that looks at clearing this and producing that sustainable carbon source that you'd need for those other PTX element of it. Because I think when we talk about hydrogen, but let's look at the bigger picture and those considerations, which comes back to, let's do proper accounting for.
I think that's a very interesting point. Thinking beyond hydrogen, if you want to go towards methanol or jet fuel, etc., you need a carbon source that should be a renewable one and not from fossil sources, and the encouragement of scrub, etc., seems to be a potential source, which I think so far in the European debate, I think it's not included, and it's something interesting I learned. Talking about Europe, Lawrence, how do you perceive the debate on standards and certification between Europe and South Africa? Is there still a big gap? Will Africa just have to follow rules established in the north? I want to come to the point, why on earth is the region that is the big potential producer and not at the table when certification and standards are debated?
So maybe to talk about what sustainability certification involves, and then to comment on the specific question. I think firstly, obviously it's about greenhouse gas emissions, the full life cycle carbon footprint, and as well as the renewable nature of the energy that's used to generate that. But it's about more than that. It is about the impact on the surrounding communities. It is about things like water scarcity, and so on. And so I think for us, although the northern countries have taken the lead on green hydrogen certification, there's nothing that prevents us from taking part in some of those initiatives. There's obviously the law, there's the RED 2 and the delegated acts, which is every country's prerogative to legislate in the way that they see themselves meeting their carbon obligations. And if you want to export to those countries, you have to satisfy their requirements. And then there's the certification schemes, which are not necessarily law, but which you have to comply to if you want to sell. And there, I think, is an opportunity for us to be involved. And there's nothing that prevents us from developing our own certification scheme. I feel strongly that we should that if we should develop familiarity with certification, and we should play around with it and quickly. And if we adopt, or if we create a certification scheme, we should learn from the lessons elsewhere, but there's nothing that prevents us from having additional requirements. South Africa has an unusual problem with electricity in comparison to our development level, and you cannot have a huge green hydrogen plant right next door to people who sit without power for an hour or two every night. But I think that green hydrogen is part of the solution and not part of the problem. Maybe just to say, so I think the green hydrogen certification, if you look at the principles that are in them, firstly, of course, it promotes the decarbonization that is in all our interest. Someone said CO2 doesn't have a passport and doesn't need a visa. And if you look at the NBI recently published some maps of what South Africa could look like if climate change really takes hold, and it's a scary picture. So it's very much in our interest not to let Bloemfontein be part of the Kalahari. Much as we love the Kalahari, it must stay there. And the other is, if we want to sell, if we want to create an export market, we have to understand that and comply with that. And then also the financiers are increasingly have sustainability requirements. And lastly, I think it aligns with our own just transition objectives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Alexander is showing me the time. We have 8 minutes left. I haven't yet invited the audience to maybe raise their hands. If I do, I may run the risk of not ending in time. But I see some people who may have ideas to add to our discussion. So, yes, Jan, you want to maybe add something, but if you raise your hands already for me to see who wants to add additional dimensions. I think your comment was very important. Certification, you can go on. Africa should maybe try to establish its premium green label because you can. So, Jan, what can development cooperation do to support such a process in partner countries?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, first of all, I would like to completely agree. I mean, the regulatory framework in Europe is kind of the one hand, but it's definitely going to be about green hydrogen in the future, and it's probably going to be even stricter requirements moving forward. And from what I understand, from what we see, South Africa really has the potential to be on the leading front, especially when we look at renewable energy. Kind of, we're in Europe, we still have the discussion about additionality or not. Here in South Africa, it's basically cheaper. It's easier than in Western Europe, than in Germany, and you need that in the end to also produce competitive green hydrogen and derivatives. And what we can do as a development ministry, what we do with the GIZ is, for example, then understanding, okay, what are the local potential? So what, not only the export market, what is also the local offtake for hydrogen? What are the value chains? What other products can be derived? So the horizontal value chain, but maybe even vertical, like we talked about platinum and fuel cells. This could be a whole other industry to look at and to develop, looking kind of at the economic and social impact of green hydrogen.
Right.
We're also looking at the more holistic picture. We have a study looking at what could a green hydrogen economy bring to the SDGs. And just one more point, regarding the funding. We're also trying to fund, as I said, those sustainable solutions. And just as at the COP recently, we launched with the KfW, our development fund for green hydrogen. So we also took €500 million into that fund in order to develop local green hydrogen PTX projects with an emphasis on these sustainability criteria, with an emphasis on the local value chain and an emphasis on local offtake.
Well, this sounds good. I'm wondering how Makoma and Farai would have access and support for ensuring that civil society organizations are part in the planning and monitoring of these projects. I mean, are there initial initiatives? I mean, hearing that you are sitting on a presidential committee is encouraging, but it's not only at that level that we need the voice of environmental and social civil society organizations heard. So are there any efforts to do this? And then I will move over there for the question.
I think
please.
just to summarize that, I would want to say that free, prior, informed consent and transparency are important.
Yes.
So in whatever you do, if you don't have that, you've lost it.
Thank you that you also mentioned transparency, which is another issue, because if large amounts of money are coming into a country, there is always a risk of intransparency. In the oil and gas sector in other countries, we can see to what that leads, and you want definitely to avoid that. I move that to be able to say that at least the audience was also involved. There is a chance for others still. Yes, I'm sure, Ernst, you get the microphone, please.
Okay, thank you. Tilman Altenberg, German Development Institute. I would like to raise one question that hasn't been discussed much here. So I fully agree, prior informed consent, due diligence, these things are very important. But in terms of the overall narrative, it's very much, we hear lots of promises about industrial linkages, direct employment creation, indirect employment creation, but we know this is all very capital intensive and high tech and driven by foreign technology mainly. So in the last 20, 30 years, we haven't seen a lot of linkages happening, and I'm not overly optimistic that the whole story will be very different now. Then that takes me to the question that the main thing that we can, that South Africa can gain immediately would be revenues, right? So you would have export revenues from ammonia, etc. But what do you do with it? So this were the questions that I would like to raise. Who pays for all the infrastructure investments? What about the projects that are all based in SEZs with lots of tax breaks, etc.? No? And what about revenue sharing? So you have, if the employment channel is not so strong, I would look at the revenue share, at the revenue channel more, and there could be schemes like direct payments to citizens. There could be all sorts of arrangements to have public shares, etc. And I would like to see a discussion on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure that this is the right panel for asking these questions. It is important, obviously, and on the other hand, I think the labor implications of these projects are huge, but they imply that you do proper skilling of the people, and not only during the construction phase, but in a longer perspective. But maybe some of you want to answer. I take another second question or comment before I have to go back.
Thank you, Hanno. My name is Ernst Müller. I'm a lawyer from Herbert Smith Freehills. It's a comment rather than a question. I act for the Green Hydrogen Organization and actively advise them on the standard as well as on the contract guidance notes. And this is an invitation to anybody in the room. If you have something you want to add to those, the Green Hydrogen Organization is very open to commentary, and they appreciate that you can see further if you work together, if you stand on each other's shoulders. So if you are interested in submitting comments, please come and get my card. I'll give you the details and you can share it with us. Because yeah, Heino and I both worked on the stand, and we can tell you we are very focused on things like human rights, incorporating free, prior and informed consent in certification processes.
Well, thank you. That was the advertisement section. But seriously, I think we need to advance on that. Lawrence, you grabbed the microphone. We are probably over time, but we started 10 minutes late, so I would each of you give the chance to have a final statement on what you think is critical now in the next steps, both here in the country and maybe also listening from the north, what we take home in order to improve our policy approaches. But Lawrence, if you want to start.
Want me to start? So maybe to quickly just comment on the question on the economics of the green hydrogen economy. We're actually, Rebel is doing a study for the IDC on the economic impact of the green hydrogen strategy. And at the moment, I mean, it's a very capital intensive endeavor. There's not a lot of labor in it, but so you have the direct effects, GDP, export, balance of payment, and so on, which are fairly easy to calculate if the assumptions about the growth is right. But then you have indirect effects, and if we don't manufacture some of that locally, then we have export leakage. Then most of that benefit leaves our shores, including if the finance is mainly depends of course on the nature of the finance, and then finally have your induced effects from the actual consumers. But at the moment, as far as I know, there's no plans for income sharing or so on. I think our best opportunity is to localize more of the capital investment and maybe the financing. So South African corporates sit with a lot of uninvested funds, and there's various reasons why they're not investing that. But just quickly on what we should do, I think there's a balance between going too quickly and going too slowly, and that's a problem of regulation. There's this regulatory gap. I think we should use mechanisms that allow us to move quickly but safely. Things like regulatory sandboxes, which are used in Germany, where you can do something that the current legislation doesn't allow for you, but you can, on an experimental basis, start trying that out so you don't lose pace. I'll end with that.
Well, thank you. I mean, you've briefly touched on something which is called the Dutch disease issue, that yes, you're rich in resources, you should have a huge inflow of revenues, but often it is a major problem for your existing economy. It distorts exchange rates. Maybe Namibia, South Africa isn't so much the problem, but a country like Namibia will have to really deal with these implications, which may then have negative impacts on the development of their own domestic industry, etc. So these issues need to be addressed. But maybe, Gian, Germany currently still is in the G7 presidency. Germany, under the G7 presidency, worked towards a hydrogen action pact. Unfortunately, not green hydrogen action pact, but it's implied. But already at the G7 level, it's difficult to agree on this kind of language. The Japanese have accepted to take this on, so there is a G7 process to develop regulatory frameworks. I would still think we need to make sure it goes beyond G7, even beyond G20, although South Africa would be at the table then. But what do you think you can do? But you had prepared your final statement, so I don't want to disturb you.
No, I think it perfectly fits in, because I think the main takeaway or the main lesson for the future is kind of this mutual learning and this cooperation. Because of course the single parts might not all be new. I mean, we know green hydrogen, we know kind of how to build new infrastructure, but kind of putting all those things together now, kind of in this complex sphere of environment, economy, social and governance, that's quite new. And that's new in Germany, in the G7 states, in the G20 states, or in the rest of the world. So I think nationally it will be important to have these platforms of exchange, of mutual learning, where we bring together business, academia, civil society, and politics. But also, of course, at an international level, kind of looking at the unique conditions, seeing how can we cooperate, how can we learn each other. And I think this is going to be key moving forward.
Well, thank you. I see the systems modeler likes to bring together the different dimensions, but it's true. We need to really operate in an interconnecting manner. Farai.
I think just to reiterate some of the points that, I think there is a window of opportunity for South Africa in this space. I mean, there is a need to move fast, but we shouldn't move fast, at the expense of other things, sustainability issues, some of which we have discussed. And maybe as while we get these regulatory frameworks and aspects in place, we can look at adopting some of those voluntary schemes. I think the last slide that you skipped at some of them, that we could look at adopting while we make sure we get our ducks in a row, so that as we started moving forward, at least we are starting from a point of view where certain sustainability safeguards have been put in place. Thanks.
Yes. So Makoma, your last statement, what is the takeaway people should take to the lunch break and beyond?
Thank you. The International Energy Agency continuously produces analysis on different energy sources. And they also have done so with the green hydrogen. I'm not really up to date, but with what their analysis has been. But this is very important because it's linked to the standards across, you know, whether it's national, continental, or international, because that's what their analysis focuses on as to what is happening. And I would think that that's how we should be able to gauge why standards are very important. And the industry, the green hydrogen industry does not have to dodge standards. They have to be there, they have to be public, same as the reports that we get from the International Energy Agency are public. So that transparency would be the kind of action that would convince people out there that the green hydrogen is really a climate mitigating technology. And if it's not like that, it's not going to be accepted because already there's criticism. So before any project is implemented, please make sure that the frameworks, there's compliance in regulatory, legislatory frameworks, including adherence to the Sustainable Development Goals and all the conventions that are aimed at protecting the environment. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful final statement because indeed, as I said, the Hydrogen Action Pact at G7 level, which is moving forward, we exactly got IEA, the International Energy Agency, and IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, together, and they committed that they will work together on setting the regulatory frameworks. And now my concern is how do we ensure that the perspectives and the voices of the South are sufficiently reflected, and I think the International Power-to-X hub is both here and in Brussels and in Berlin. So from our end, we are more than keen to help our partner countries and to help us getting the things right, because we're not allowed to fail here. We have only been able to grasp a very superficial perspective, but maybe that triggers further discussions. Our time is over. I would like to thank all of you who stayed with us, but in particular, please, a round of applause for our panel. It is always an adventure. You don't know how they fit together, and if there is a storyline. I think we've tried to actually cover quite a range of topics. So thank you very much, and enjoy the lunch and the rest of the conference. Thank you.
We would like to take this opportunity to thank the sponsors, the Green Hydrogen Summit South Africa